Now we come to the final part of this series. Part 1 mapped the deadlock. Part 2 detailed the interests of and the cost to the United States. Part 3 discussed the relevant players. This final part outlines the plan. The terms of a settlement are not a mystery, and the shape and details of a deal have been drawn up multiple times, but never executed. What has always been missing was the will. And while you cannot just mandate it into existence, this plan is designed to create the conditions for the parties to manufacture it. But before we dive deeper, recall the deadlock we discussed earlier in the series. The two hinges locked against each other. The Palestinians will not renounce their claim on Israel proper, and Israel will not move towards peace without that renunciation. The first has to give before the second can. This plan is built to release them, in that order, and it is shaped before anything else by two facts. The first is that the parties will not reach a settlement by themselves. Even with American mediation, they have tried and come up short. The Oslo process was the attempt, and it failed. This plan proposes that the settlement is not to be negotiated between the two sides. Its terms will be imposed by a coalition, with the diplomatic and political weight to do it. The second fact is that currently there is no Palestinian representative with the popular legitimacy to accept the settlement. None to take the monumental decisions and risks for peace. The conditions for one have to be built. And while those two elements drive the why, what follows is the how. To start, the whole settlement is answered at once. Every outstanding core issue is pushed together as a single package. Because a deferred issue is a place for the whole thing to unravel. And that is how the last attempt came apart. The terms and the rules that fix them are established at the start of the process. They are not open to subsequent negotiation. They are locked, and importantly backed by the world, before either side is asked to do anything. So when one side has to act, it is not a leap of faith. They are executing on a deal whose terms are already done. Now there are two things to lay out: the terms themselves, the complete fixed package, and how it is delivered, the sequence and the machinery that carries it out. First, the terms. They are not new. They are where the parameters have pointed to for decades. The borders. The 1967 Green Line acts as the starting point. The major settlement blocks beyond that line are ceded to Israel, adjusted by equal land swaps given to the Palestinians. They are ensured a state that is whole and contiguous, with a secured link between the West Bank and Gaza. Next is Jerusalem. The city is split along its demographic lines. The Jewish areas go to Israel, the Arab areas to the Palestinian state. Then the holy sites, probably the most explosive issue. The old city is divided by quarter. The Muslim, Christian, and Armenian quarters go to Palestine. The Jewish quarter goes to Israel, with a secured right-of-way. The Western Wall and the Temple Mount above it, however, need a special arrangement. The holiest ground in Judaism and the third holiest in Islam built one on top the other. Sovereignty is the wrong tool for a place that belongs wholly and at once to both. Neither gets ownership. The entire complex sits under an international regime, sovereign territory of no one. Religious control is divided as the worship is divided, similar to the current status. The Western Wall to the Jews, the Haram al-Sharif to the Muslims. Security control is neither Israeli nor Palestinian, but international. It will be overseen by a council, in which both parties will have representation, with neutral parties holding the balance between them. The security force will be drawn from those neutral parties. It needs to be capable, with the authority and mandate to keep order on the ground. Also, no digging is to be allowed beneath or behind the wall without both parties' consent. Now, security of the broader region. The Palestinian state will be demilitarized. Its defense against external threats guaranteed by outside powers. Israeli forces will not be stationed inside of them. It must be a real state, in control of its own territory. And lastly, the terms of this settlement call for finality. 2 states in full and mutual recognition, and that is the end of it. Israel is for Israelis, Palestine is for Palestinians. The borders drawn are the final borders. Every claim given up for good, with no avenue to reopen them, including the Palestinian right of return to Israel. That too is renounced, made null and void. The conflict ends here, once and for all. Now, having said all that, how is this executed? It will run in 3 phases. The first phase sets the terms and locks it in place. The coalition, the US, Europe, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Arab states endorses the settlement, the one we just laid out, as the final terms. The parties do not draft it, and they do not negotiate it. Arab and Islamic cover and support is locked in on the first day. Saudi Arabia is custodian, the OIC, the Arab League, endorses the settlement as the just and final one. The mistake at Camp David, not trying to bring our Arab partners in from the start, is not repeated here. As part of the terms, the borders are drawn. An independent, impartial boundary commission, appointed by the coalition, draws the border before any vote is taken. It is not negotiated. It applies fixed, published rules. It starts from the 1967 baseline and draws the swaps by clear criteria. The major settlement blocks to Israel set by published thresholds. As discussed earlier, an equivalent area goes to Palestine in exchange. Using the literal 1967 line would mean uprooting far too many people. Then the whole thing is locked. One binding resolution at the Security Council fixes the entire package at once, borders and all. And once it passes, the settlement is no longer a proposal. It is the standing will of the international community, not of Washington or the coalition alone. A word on the United Nations here. Seeking a Security Council resolution is not an endorsement of the institution, or a belief in its overall effectiveness. It is invoked because it is still the one body that can give an enterprise like this real international legitimacy. Like it or not, its blessing is needed. And then, with the deal approved, the first steps on the ground begin, on both sides at once. Israel is required to freeze any building outside the designated settlement blocks, and to take no action to keep a Palestinian counterparty from forming. And the money and the arms that sustain Hamas and the other armed factions get squeezed. Now, a formal barrier already exists. Hamas has been designated by the US as a terrorist organization for decades, and no legitimate bank in the American system will touch them. The price of doing it is losing access to the dollar, which is an existential price. A state caught funding them directly is cut off at the source in the same way. But sanctions have been in place against these groups for years, and they're still armed, still funded. Because the money that keeps them alive does not move through banks. It moves through the informal channels our sanctions cannot reach. The cash, the front charities, the political shelter. And for this plan to succeed, these channels need to be degraded. It is the harder effort, and it runs in part straight through the states that have kept the channel open, especially Qatar and Turkey. As discussed in Part 3, their cooperation will be critical on this front. Now, even with their help, we have to be honest about the limit. The informal channels cannot be fully sealed. The cash, the tunnels, the workarounds. However, if this is done right, we will inhibit these groups to resupply at scale. They will retain some capacity, but it cannot fund a government and a reconstruction for 2 million people. Plus, Israel and Egypt hold the perimeter, mitigating the flow of weapons and fighters. This further degrades Hamas's governing and military capacity, though like the money, it cannot be sealed off entirely. This brings us to the second phase. This is where Palestinian governance is stood up, and a reckoning begins. It is this: a people, finally, coming to terms with reality. Giving up the maximal claim, the dream of all of it, and accepting what can actually be achieved. A state. Sovereignty on real terms, instead of chasing everything and ending with nothing. That shift inside Palestinian society is the thing that has to happen before any leader can sign a settlement and make it hold. It cannot be ordered, and it should not be rushed. But it can be pushed. And this phase is how it is pushed. In the areas outside of Hamas control, an interim administration takes over. Technical, not political. Arab-backed and carrying a UN mandate, the mandate written into the resolution from the first phase. It governs, it rebuilds, it runs the daily order of the place. But it governs only what it holds. It cannot sign the deal. And it does not engage militarily with Hamas to take areas they currently control. Then we apply the carrot and the stick on two separate channels. This is first about Gaza. On the one hand, the floor of aid is supplied that reaches civilians everywhere, including areas that Hamas holds. There cannot be any starvation or deprivation. Then, on the other hand, there is reconstruction. The funds for it directed entirely to the territory under the control of the interim authority. Month by month, the differences will become stark. Hamas's zone of control will remain economically isolated, untouched by the recovery. While people will have freedom of movement out, no reconstruction funds will be allowed in. The rest of Gaza, the framework channel, moves forward with investment and rebuilding. Held in place over time, that contrast is the reckoning itself. The maximal path, the Hamas path, plainly led nowhere, while the framework path led somewhere much better, and the whole Arab world stood behind it. Through all of this, Hamas is contained, not cleared. The lines stay frozen where the war left them, and Hamas is sealed inside its corner. Israel holds the perimeter the whole way through, and Hamas is worn down not by assault, but by isolation. And then there is the West Bank. This is where the signatory is built. The occupation, the settlements are held in place, neither growing nor pulled back. This is deliberate. We have seen what an abrupt withdrawal produces. In 2005, Israel pulled its settlers and soldiers out of Gaza and handed the territory to the Palestinian Authority. Within 2 years, Hamas had won elections and then seized full control by force, turning it into a fortress, incessantly firing rockets into Israel. If the occupation is ended, while the Palestinian maximal aim is still held among the public, the rejectionists will fill the resulting power vacuum, as they did in Gaza. So on the surface, the status quo remains. But underneath, real work will go on. Economic development, institutions, governance, overhauling the education system, a trained and capable Palestinian security force able to take over when Israel withdraws, building the capacity to run a state, and laying the groundwork that can undergird a legitimate national authority, the body that can finally sign. This is the counterparty being constructed piece by piece. Now one might argue that governing institutions built under occupation would be seen as illegitimate, akin to the Palestinian Authority. The difference here is that the end state is fixed from the start and backed by the Arab world. Now the third phase is the exchange, and it happens in sequence. The Palestinians go first. A renewed national mandate through elections produces a legitimate national authority. The entity phase 2 has been working toward. The timing of the vote, set by benchmarks, written in advance, not by anyone's discretion. Led by someone willing and able to use the standing it gives him. That authority then takes up the standing offer, and the renunciation goes on the table. Real and committed, but conditional. It is final only once Israel performs. And given all the groundwork done beforehand, going first is not the leap it looks like. The deal is already locked in place, already backed by the world. The Palestinians are not gambling on Israeli goodwill. They are carrying out a settlement that is already done. And their renunciation is not taken on their word, or on Israel's. A neutral body, established under the original Security Council resolution, stood up for exactly this purpose, does two things. One, it declares the renunciation binding, once given by the newly elected national authority. Two, it confirms the security force is capable of holding order on the ground. Neither side rules on it. The same logic as the Boundary Commission. The judgment is taken out of the hands of the parties and put onto fixed rules applied by a neutral body. And once it is certified, it is Israel's turn. While some might be skeptical, at this point a rational Israeli government has no reason to balk. It has already gotten the thing it could never get before: a legitimate Palestinian renunciation. The challenge to his existence as a Jewish state closed. The threat that justified perpetual occupation gone. And there's more. Normalization with the Arab world, the strategic realignment of the region around it. To refuse now is to walk away from the strongest position the Israeli state has ever found itself in. That is not a trade any clear-eyed government makes. But if some Israeli government did balk, it is the lone holdout, against an internationally binding deal, backed by the whole world, from which it has already gotten its central demand. For the United States, its central backer, the cost at home has changed. Standing by Israel through an open, bleeding conflict was one thing. Standing by it as the party blocking the peace that ends it is another. So the United States can bring its substantial levers to bear, because what hangs in the balance is enormous. A historic settlement to one of the most enduring conflicts on Earth. The first real end to it, within reach. No American president lets that go. So Israel does what the deal requires. It removes the settlers outside the major blocks. The IDF withdraws in full from the now Palestinian state. The arrangement at the holy sites stands up. The conflict ends. The claims end. And whatever rejectionists are left, a collapse in contained Hamas above all, will be the new Palestinian state's problem to deal with. And now it will be able to do so with the legitimacy Israel never had. They will not need to eliminate every single fighter. The bar will be a remnant that a normal state can police. So that's the plan. And despite its sequencing and its terms, a lot can go wrong. In fact, a great deal can go wrong. This is one of the hardest problems in the world. And a plan this long, complex, and interlocked has a hole at every joint. I am not going to walk through all of them. To do that would take far longer than this series has. In the end, they are tangled together. Pull on one problem, and you find three others behind it. So let me name a few of the most glaring. The ones that could sink the whole thing. The first is the Palestinian reckoning. Everything rests on it. Does it give up the maximal claim and produce a leader who can make the renunciation and make it stick? Because the maximal claim is not just Hamas's. It is held across a large segment of the population, passed down through generations, taught in the schools, woven into the national story. Giving it up is not simply a policy shift. It cuts deeply to who they are. The plan can build the conditions for it. Its very structure, the international support, the institutions, the security force, Hamas worn down and discredited, the contrast laid out in the ground. The Arab and Islamic world also help give it permission. And it is ultimately in their national interest to do so. But strip all that away, and what is left is the oldest variable there is: human will. Can they overcome? The second is the violence. There will be rejectionist attacks throughout all of this, and it is inevitable. The sharpest danger is an early, high-casualty event, before the contrast has had time to show, designed to provoke a response that sets off a cycle of violence that brings the whole thing down. But the risk runs the entire way through. The spoilers will attack precisely in order to break the process. And the question is whether Israel can keep its response measured again and again and prevent the whole enterprise from collapsing. The third is the holy sites. The plan puts a Temple Mount in the Western Wall under no one's sovereignty, with an international force to secure it. It is the cleanest answer to ground that both faiths claim. But it is also the most flammable place in the entire conflict. A single visit to that esplanade by an Israeli leader once helped spark a years-long wave of violence. So the real question is not whether the arrangement for the site is reasonable. It is whether a force capable of holding it can be deployed at all. Because it has to be a real military, not observers in blue helmets. Whose soldiers stand on that ground? It would fall to neutral nations, one with the capability to hold it, and the will to put their own troops in one of the most contested places on earth. That is the bind. The site needs a serious force, and it's one thing to commit diplomatic and economic resources to resolve the conflict. It's another to commit your own troops. The fourth is the Israeli settlers and far right. A renunciation takes their best weapon away. Once the threat to Israel's existence as a Jewish state is off the table, the security case that gives the settlers the country's backing is gone. The wider public may share the biblical attachment to the land, but most would trade it for peace. What is left is a political faction holding a religious claim that most of the rest of the country would give up. The center can face them down politically, but executing withdrawal on the ground is going to be extremely difficult. The numbers of people outside the larger settlement blocks, the force it may take. The withdrawal from Gaza was instructive in this regard, and that involved around 8,000 settlers. A withdrawal from the West Bank would involve the removal of somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 100,000. And a portion of them are armed and fanatical. More than likely, they would fight. This would be Israelis against Israelis, not a foreign enemy. It would be its own kind of hard. And the fifth is the coalition, and above all, the Saudis. Because without sustained will across the coalition, the entire initiative unravels. The Saudis are the keystone. If they do not commit, the cover they provide collapses, and the prize collapses with it. The pressure from their own public is intense, and has only hardened in recent years. Is a Security Council resolution, backed by the United States, fixing the final terms, enough to give their leadership cover? Even if their interest says yes, their public may not let them. Whether it can outweigh that pressure when the moment actually comes is an open question. Those are 5. There are many more. The roots they run back to are different. But overcoming them comes down to one thing: like most things in human affairs. Will. So let me close where this began. A resolution to this conflict is in America's interest. And in the end, it is in the interests of the two parties as well. For the Palestinians, a real state, contiguous, with a capital in East Jerusalem, and the occupation finally ended. For the Israelis, the conflict is over. Security and finality and normalization with the Arab world, and the existential question at last resolved. And for America, a region that is more stable, an issue that loses its power at home and abroad, its primacy consolidated. The Islamic Republic of Iran loses, and the freedom, finally, to turn to the Pacific. But knowing all of that has never been enough. The history here and the emotion run deep, and they are hard, very hard to overcome. This plan most certainly can fail, the costs of which are not free. A failed attempt can burn through capital and embolden the rejectionists, and spark a sharper round of violence. The collapse of Camp David ran straight into the Second Intifada. But the difficulty and danger is not a reason to walk away, because that is the nature of one of the hardest problems on earth. Every alternative is worse. Doing nothing, we have seen. Recognizing a Palestinian state on its own is the worst kind of symbolism. It feels to some like progress while changing nothing on the ground. And negotiation between the two parties is Oslo, and it is Camp David. It has been tried, and it has failed. But peace is not free either. There are the costs of acceptance. These are real, and they fall on the two parties. For the Palestinians, the right of return given up. The keys surrendered. No political sovereignty over the holy places. The maximal dream set down for good. For the Israelis, the withdrawal, the evacuation of the settlers outside the blocks, no flag over the holiest of sites. These are wrenching things to give up. That is exactly why the history and the emotion make them so hard to bear. So in the end, it comes down to will. Can a majority be found and held together that sees the thing as it is? Because peace is not made through being right. It is made through the acknowledgement of reality. And for us, it is not about who is right. It is about what the conflict costs America and what America can do about it.